you tell us your own story? Where were you born?
I was born in Cairo, Egypt, and then immigrated to the United States with my parents in the early 80s and spent some time in the United States. I went to university in Washington, D.C., and then immediately afterwards started working for NBC News in Washington. This was at the time of 9/11, so there was a great deal of shortage of Arabic speakers and perhaps journalists in the U.S. who had an understanding of the Middle East and that part of the world as they were trying to make sense of what had happened on 9/11 and its relation. And then the following year, there was the rumblings that the Iraq War was about to begin. So once again, all the American networks began to beef up their operations overseas, started looking for journalists with any kind of experience or people who spoke Arabic. And I went to go work for CNN, covered the Iraq War and its aftermath. Did that for 2.5 years based in Baghdad, and then Al-Jazeera International decided to launch an English language channel, and I went from CNN to Al-Jazeera. And
what was that like to go into Gaza and to be there for the Israeli attack?
It was a very difficult time, and to be quite honest with you, there was a ceasefire that had been agreed to between Hamas and Israel in June of 2008. So I had arrived there a month earlier, just as things were beginning to quiet down. So there was a great sense of hope that this ceasefire that had taken place would actually begin to lift the blockade. It was a very simple ceasefire. The Israelis would ease the blockade and siege on Gaza in exchange for a halt of rocket fire. Now, by Israel's own admission, from the middle of June until November 4th, and I'll get to that in just a second, why November 4th, but until that point, this ceasefire actually worked. There was at least a 98% reduction of rockets fire into southern Israel, but the blockade was not necessarily eased. And so on November 4th, while the U.S. and all the major media around the world were consumed with the U.S. elections and President Obama's victory, Israel carried out a deadly raid that killed 6 Palestinians. And so essentially it shattered the ceasefire. The next day, a barrage of rocket fire came out of Gaza, and we found ourselves in a cycle of violence that led us up to the war on December 27th. But that period from November till December 27th was a very intense, very difficult period. Israel had really tightened the siege. I mean, we were dealing with unprecedented levels of suffrage, and a lot of people started describing it, what many still do, a humanitarian catastrophe and a disaster.
And of course, Israel launched the attack in the waning days of the Bush administration and ended it just before Barack Obama was inaugurated as president.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't. The media absence is what allowed this war to take place. And I say that because this particular war was unprecedented for several reasons. One, it was really the first time in almost modern warfare where you had a largely civilian and defenseless population subject to an attack by sophisticated modern military without giving them the chance to flee. Even in Iraq and Afghanistan, the civilian population can at least disperse from areas where they think the fighting may take place. That didn't happen in the Gaza Strip. And on top of that, the absence of major media organizations was not able to capture what was really happening on the ground, and that was reflected in the tone that came out in their coverage.
I'm curious, in your switch from the American news media, from NBC and CNN to Al Jazeera, especially in the context of what Mohammed Omer was saying about his disgust with the news coverage here in the United States, could you give us a sense of what's different about what you're able to do at Al Jazeera that you weren't able to do at CNN or at NBC?
Absolutely. I think to be fairly accurate, one has to dissect many of the fundamental problems with American media structure. It's very easy just to criticize a particular day's coverage, but there are fundamental inherent problems with the corporate media structure in the United States. They're ultimately competing for viewers for ratings, and for ratings means you have to put out a product that you think will draw attention. Not necessarily what you as a journalist think is the best product, but what you as a journalist think is going to get you the best rating. That inherent flaw determines so much of the editorial content that gets put out on media. Al Jazeera is very similar to a BBC model. We don't have any corporate pressures on us. Our editorial guidelines are not determined by what will improve our ratings for the sake of corporate sponsorship deals. So it's a very liberating experience as a journalist to be working in that free environment. You have to pitch stories on the quality and the caliber of the events that are happening, not on what you think is going to get you a higher ratings boost in prime time or in the morning shows and stuff like that. So there are some inherent, and I was just going to say one more point. the lack of diversity within American major news networks reflects also an inability to understand complex regions such as the Middle East, where the U.S. is heavily understood. I mean, maybe now in the post-9/11 era, there has been a push to try to diversify. But when I was working at most of these major news organizations on the domestic side, one can be very critical in terms of the diversity, not just of the composition of the people, but of thinking, of the ideas that one can bring to the table. Not very encouraging.
And what do you think you were able to bring out from inside Gaza at the time of the attack that the Western media missed?
I was able to bring out context, because in reality what we had was news agencies that were able to bring out pictures, so there was no shortage of the pictures nor the information. But really what we did miss in that Gaza war from a Western media perspective was context. You know, and one example I often cite is when I was in Gaza, the Israeli military dropped hundreds of thousands of leaflets on the people of Gaza, telling them, you know, your area is going to be bombed, you have to leave. If you know of a Hamas hideout or a Hamas building or anything, please call this number and give us the intelligence. Now, a lot of Western media portrayed that as a humanitarian gesture, and in fact, it was cited over and over by Israeli military spokespeople and picked up by Western media as the Israeli military is trying to avoid civilian casualties. But having been on the ground in Gaza and having those leaflets fall on me, I can tell you it scared the hell out of me to get a sheet of paper saying, you're about to be bombed, and not telling me where I can flee and what I can do. And it also presumes that I, as someone living in Gaza, am responsible for a building next door, to know what is taking place there, to know that it is a legitimate, in the Israeli perspective, a legitimate Israeli military target. And that's something that is very presumptuous. We don't know in this city what is taking place in the building next door to us. And if the American government were to come and say, you're responsible, you should know that there's a Hamas building next door, leave the area, and then if not, we're going to bomb you. That's not, you know, that's not justifiable action, nor is it proportional. And that is the context that was missing from a lot of the coverage.
I'd like to also, going back to Mohammed Omer, and your criticism of Fox News and the American media, could you give us an assessment of what the impact of Al-Jazeera has been not only in Gaza, but throughout the world, in terms of a different perspective on the news that didn't exist a decade ago?